slightly earlier time this week, so Richard could actually slope away and meet his family at some decent hour. So I'm joined by Richard Large and Chris Kirk this week. So Chris Kirk, a veteran's voice chap, and Richard is going to talk to us about his experiences. He's fresh out of the military, and he's got a job of veterans on the veterans program with Goldman Sachs. So we're going to talk about that in a bit. So usual crack. If you've got any comments, fire them into the chat, and I'll shout you out, and we'll crack on. So welcome, Richard, and welcome, Chris. How are you doing?
Good. Nice to be back once again.
Indeed, yeah, like a bad penny. So Chris and I first met sort of just through chance on commenting on posts, but Richard, you and I met. You attended one of my foundation courses through the Office Association. I think Chris drummed you into coming anyway, didn't he? So that's where we first met. We've got Mark Lindell on, a veteran as well from Veterans Voice. Hi, Mark. So yeah, you joined. We've known each other for about a year now. So just give us a bit of a flavour of what you did in the military, and then what made you decide to press the button to come out.
So hi everyone. I did 14 years all up in the Royal Marines. It was a bit of split service, so I did just over 5 years, left, and then came back and did 9 more years in the Corps. My time in the Marines was predominantly spent within Armoured Support Group, so working with the Viking platform down at Bovington, 3 tours of Afghan, and all the other usual sort of Norway deployments and everything else, and finished up as a training senior down at ASG. The main sort of reason for wanting to leave, I guess, is probably similar to quite a few people's. I had a young family, so I just felt that it was time to sort of move on and be at home and be present. So that's kind of what pushed me to leave.
And how did the transition go?
I think I mentioned in a couple of posts, resettlement's a job in itself. I remember speaking to Chris really early on, and he said, just plan it out and balance it out as best as you can, because it is work. And he was 100% on the mark. You kind of finish work, go back to the grot, and then you're networking, you're planning, you're researching, you're doing all this sort of stuff in your own time. I remember being in Norway and doing like networking calls in a storeroom, in my spare time. It does take it out of you. And I'd say to people when they're going through it, yes, it's a lot of work, but you have got to try and have those moments where you can just step away from it, even just for a day, and give yourself a break, because it's quite challenging.
But that's the difference. If you do it properly, if you do transition properly and actually take the bull by the horns and take it with the intention that it's there for, rather than just coast your final 9 months and then 3 months to go think, oh Christ, I better do something. So you're doing the right thing there. Okay, story. I mean, I'm in a glorious Airbnb at the moment doing stuff. You do these networking events and these Zoom calls from wherever you can get a signal.
Absolutely.
So you came out of the Marines, and did you go straight into work? Did you find work in the Marines? How did that come
about? So I kind of planned ahead. So before pushing the button and going to go outside, it was like, right, what do I want to do first? So kind of took the time to identify some opportunities. Pretty early on, came on to financial services, had an old boss who'd gone through the JP Morgan scheme, and it just kind of went from there. And then kind of noticed that the majority of the schemes started in February. So I was like, well, okay, we'll follow up with, one of the schemes. So I did that. Went through, and by the time I got to my last day in unit, I had my offer from Goldman Sachs, which meant that I could then spend my GRT and terminal leave with my family, just relaxing, and that's obviously the ideal position to be in. I know a few people who haven't been in that position and have had to work through that period to try and get something. Some people right up until the end, but I was fortunate, and I think if you plan it right, and if FS is the way you want to go and the schemes are the way you want to go, look at put your notice in around about February, March time, and then hopefully, all being well, you'll get to the end of like your last day in work with an offer, and you can just go and you can relax and chill for a couple of weeks, before starting, your new job, because, having been at Goldman now for 3 weeks, it's pretty full on once you get in. So, just take that opportunity when it presents itself to rest.
And so, yeah, 3 weeks, you're fresh out. So the knowledge that you've got and you can impart on fellow transitioners is second to none, really, because you've taken the transition in the spirit with which it's intended. You've put yourself out there. You've networked. You've improved your LinkedIn profile. You've had those conversations, and as a result, you walk straight out into a job, which is brilliant, commendable.
Yeah. It's like I say, it's definitely work, and what you put in is what you get out. I think with this process, like you said, you got to take the bull by the horns. If you just sit back and have a basic LinkedIn profile and think that recruiters are just going to come to you and go, "Oh, you're amazing, come and work for us," that doesn't happen. You've really got to put yourself out there and get to events and speak to people, and just make sure you're doing all the right things. And 9 times out of 10, it will all work out.
Yeah, absolutely. Just say a quick hello to some people here. So we've got Terry from across the pond in the US of A. So hi, Terry. Hope everything's all right with you. And we have Adam as well. So hi, Adam. And then I'll give Mark a second go because he's worth it. And he sent me 2 mugs, which is really nice of him. And my wife and children have nicked them both, Mark, by the way. So I'm going to have to go and wrestle them back. So you're in Goldman Sachs, and are you straight in the door? Are you straight into a job, or are you on a scheme? What's the score?
Yeah, so kind of similar to I'd say it's the JP Morgan scheme and to Barclays, in that so this is a 12-week program. So essentially, it's a 12-week internship. You come in, you're assigned a role. So when you go through the process, so just to touch on the process itself, so applications normally open in September. That will be a CV and cover letter sift. If you get through that, you do hire view, which is one of the most awkward interviews you will ever sit, because it's just questions on a screen. And you answer it to a screen. You don't speak to anyone, and then if you get through that, you then get invited in for interviews for positions. So for me, I interviewed for 2 operations roles, knowing that if I passed one of those, I would come into an operations role within the bank, and that's what happened. So I now work in operations within private wealth management. And so, so coming in to the bank itself, your first 2 days are kind of orientation, onboarding and training. And then you're onto your desk. I got into my desk, I sat down with my manager. We went through my deliverables for the next 12 weeks, expectations, what they're looking for me to push out. And then you're straight into it. There is no easing into it, but it's not to say you just chucked at the deep end and left. I'm surrounded by people who are there willing to help. It's a very collaborative environment. People want to help. We're all driving towards the same goal, and that's what you'll find. If you come into these organizations, yes, they're high performance. It's a lot at stake, but people are genuinely there to help, and that's what I've found so far.
And how's the briefing? You say you sat down, you're given your objectives. How's that compared to a military brief?
In some ways, more detailed. In some ways, it was very specific of projects and everything else. And in others, it gave you a bit more freedom. I think you'll find in these organisations, the freedom to go to people at all levels is definitely more so than in the military, where if I need to speak to an OC, I've probably got to go speak to my sergeant major first and just be like, I just need 5 minutes with the OC just to talk about this. I don't have to do that here. If I need to speak to someone, I reach out to them and say, can I get 30 minutes of your time just to talk through this? And like I said, 99.9% of the time it's let's sit down and do it. But they'll give you the the sort of the overall objective of what they want you to achieve. They'll give you the first person normally that you need to speak to, and then it's big boys rules. Go speak to that person, and move forward with your work and your projects. You have to have a bit of your own initiative about yourself, I think, in these environments. But like I said, if at any point I find myself not sure where to go next, I can revert back to my manager or someone on my desk and say, look, this is where I'm at. Where should I go next? So it is a little bit of both, I guess, with regards to that. But I kind of just like the freedom just to get on with it, and my freedom to organise my day how I want it. I know in the military it's very structured. You'll be in at this time, we'll work through to this time. This is lunchtime, and then you're back in, working through to this time. Whereas here, I can sort of pick and choose when I sit at my desk, or if I need to go and speak to someone, if I need to have a networking chat with someone, even to a point where my start and finish time is very flexible, and it's more about output here and production and meeting your objectives, as opposed to you will be in work from 08 through to 16:30, 1700 every day.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a breather for a second. I'm going to bring Chris in, and is that a similar experience to what you had with JP Morgan?
Yes, super similar. So I went through the JP Morgan equivalent of their military program, and really, really similar. Super collaborative environment. Our program's slightly longer, so you have kind of 6 months, but it can be extended up to 12 months if people need it. So I get the impression just from what Rich has said here, it's maybe not as fast a pace. There's definitely a bit more of a take your time and learn, and then then the pace ramps up naturally. And I think like what Rich has said is super interesting. And I think there's 3 sort of key areas of learning when you land in the bank from coming from the military. You've got the actual what would you say, like the subject matter or the knowledge learning. So that would be like, in Rich's case, he works in client ops. There's all the processes and procedures and regulations around client ops in whatever particular area that he's, focused on. So there's the actual SME knowledge. Then you've got the stakeholder knowledge, and that's the bit that he's touched quite largely on, is that when you land in these programs and stuff, quite often you'll get given a project exactly the same as what Rich has said, and you're given what they want the output to be, but it's up to you how you get there, how you navigate your way through. And a lot of that is stakeholder management, and that's another knowledge set to build up, i.e. who are my stakeholders and who does what, and how can I help them and how can they help me. And then the third piece of it's organizational, and it's kind of just, it's a bit of like stakeholder, so you understand where people sit in the organization, and that's going to allow you to understand who you need to speak to get particular things signed off and done. But the other aspect of it is how that organization lives and breathes, how they do business, how their organization, how we manage risk in my case, or how in Rich's case, how Goldman Sachs onboards clients and how they maintain client relationship and all that will be different to how we do it at JP Morgan. And so there's the 3 like sort of areas that you need to learn, and you learn them simultaneously as you're going through. But it's very much a steep learning curve, but like sounds really similar to what my experience was.
So Chris, you work in risk management.
So I work in the private bank, the international private bank, not the US private bank. So very similar to what Rich does. So, but my particular focus is around, so where, to try and like give the context, so where Rich works in operations is I support a multitude of different operations teams. So I work in the middle office space, but I don't support the client ops. That's one of my colleagues, but I support, say, all the alternatives, investments and trades and derivatives and precious metals and all the kind of BAU stuff, as it were, from a middle office perspective. So and a lot of it's like working really close with them as my sort of ops partners to understand what are their risks and how do we mitigate them, and open issues and action plans, and very, very risk management focused.
And so is that looking at the risks with the investment or the risks within the business, or both?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So no, so that's portfolio risk management. So that's a completely different aspect. This is more. There's regulatory risk. There's business risk, and that's where we sit. And the risk is also related to what the role is within the bank. So if you put front, middle, and back office, where you sit in middle office operations, a lot of our risk is around trade reconciliation, trade management, pre-trade, all the kind of booking and the internal like gubbins, as it were, of how a process, if you've got the process flow, it starts with the front end and finishes with the back end. We sit in very much in the middle. And so it's any risk that's related to, and certainly from our case, it's a lot more related to client reputation, bank reputation, and managing the risk within that area, as it were.
Yeah, I'm pleased you brought the technical term in there, gubbins. So, and just coming back onto you again, Richard. So, operations, it's not like an operation, a military operation. It's not like an oil and gas or a marine operations. How does that work?
Yeah, so I think Chris has kind of touched on it a little bit there. Operations covers a multitude of functions. Whereas like if you talk about operations in the military sense, I was an operations senior. You're working with an operations officer, and so for ASG, for instance, when I was down there, it was all about, okay, we've got these deployments coming up, these exercises coming up. You work with the ops officer to make sure that all happens, everything that goes into it, the recce's that need to happen, all the planning and implementation. Okay, you make that happen. Whereas operations within a corporate setting or within a bank is split down into functions. So like Chris said, my function is within client operations, so client onboarding. So I focus specifically on that operational function, and I think that's the key difference. Don't be in the military and be like, oh, I was an ops officer, or I was an ops senior, I've done operational planning, and think it's going to be the same in a corporate setting. It's very niche and particular. It's a very sort of dedicated sort of skill set. I mean, that's not to say that at some point you can't move into another area of operations, and in most cases they encourage it because it develops a breadth of understanding. But you need to understand that these organizations, are so big and complex and governed by regulation that it would be impossible to kind of control or be involved with a multitude of functions at the same time. You kind of need to focus on one, work in that area, and then build that knowledge up. So I'd say that's the key difference, is that operations in the military is more of a generalist, just handling the training and deployments and the operational cycle for that unit for the year. Whereas in a bank, it's very much you are operations within this function, you work on this operations team, and you deliver this function to the process. So for me, client onboarding, client operations within the private wealth management area.
And client onboarding, is that you're working with what I would call a client relations manager,
so we work with the sales side of the business. So obviously they're the ones that are face to face with the client, ensuring that their needs are met. They're getting whatever accounts it is that they want, whatever they want set up. Once that comes through the request, it then comes through to client onboarding, and then we will process that account. And it's all about KYC and AML. So know your client, know your customer, or and the anti-money laundering side of things as well. Obviously, we need to know these high net worth clients that are coming in. We just need to check the source of wealth, and just make sure that we meet all the regulatory standards. And as you can imagine, there's some quite big regulation pieces in there. It's quite a complex process. So you imagine trying to do that plus all the other things that go into the operational function of the private bank. It would be impossible to cover it all off, which is why they break it down into those functional areas.
And it is worth considering or worth remembering that a bank is a business, and therefore you've got all of the business functions and some within an organization. So if you're going into finance, or thinking of leaving the armed forces and going into finance, it is a commercial organization, and it has all of these departments with it. It's not like in Mary Poppins, you walk into the bank and put your tuppence in, and that is invested. It's a whole big operation nowadays. And so if you're looking at a specific area to go into, then finance has probably got that. And there's a lot of people, a lot of financial organisations nowadays looking for ex-military people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like you said, they're big, organizations, and there's a multitude of roles. You don't have to come in. Don't think like Wolf of Wall Street. It's not that. If you want to work the client-facing, revenue-generating roles, then yeah, of course, that's an option. But there's, for every person that's facing a client or dealing with that revenue generation, there's a multitude of teams behind them that's enabling that process to happen. Then you've got, you what you'd call almost like your combat service support that are making sure that the business as a whole, runs from day to day. So, when thinking about financial services, don't get it in your head, I'm not good at sales. I don't want to be, dealing with markets or whatever it may be. There's a multitude of roles and a multitude of opportunities, and that's why FS is such a good route to go for service leavers, because you can get into an organization like Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, and the mobility to move around. So we've come in, I've come in as operations, Chris has come in risk, but there's nothing to say that in the future we can't move and work another and try a different role. There's opportunities to move. And I'd say probably compare it to the military, especially if you're in the Corps, in the Marines. It's easier to move between roles and being in the Corps and saying, "Oh, I'm in this spec, I want to go this spec," and you wait 4 or 5 years to get your transfer through. It's not like that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you've got there's a lot of people say project management, but there is project management within the finance sector as well.
Absolutely, and that's a tiny aspect of it again, and that's one of my views on why I went into financial services was because of the reasons that Rich has just said. There's a breadth of opportunity, so you land in client onboarding, but that's definitely not where Rich will finish his career. I guarantee it. There's going to be other opportunities come up. And it's going back to what I was saying about the 3 levels of understanding. What Rich is developing is that specialist knowledge in client onboarding, which will serve him well in other areas. But you're also building, as I said, simultaneously how that organisation does business, and then also your stakeholder engagement. So and just as an example, what would be a really good move for Rich, or what would be an excellent move if he ever decided to go down this road, was a client ops control manager, because he understands the client ops process and he brings the risk management experience from the military. So that would be a seamless one. And say even for me, for example, I work closely with the derivatives team. So I'm not to say that there wouldn't be a learning curve for me, but I could look to move to a more operational role, say in the derivatives team as an example, because I work really closely with them. Yeah, okay, I don't understand the intricacies of the processes, but I understand at high level to understand how to manage the risk. And this is the beauty of banking. And then even then you can turn around and go a completely different road and say, I want to go into, say, payments, because neither of us is anywhere near payments, or cash and card operations. Again, a lot of the skills are super transferable, and again, a lot of it's skill that you take over, as in who are my stakeholders, how does this organisation do business.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a quick hello to Richard, who's joined us finally. You're late, 20 minutes late. Just a question for Richard. What you're not Richard here, but Richard Wade, is what are you drinking tonight? Because he usually joins us from a pub when he's away on business. So what's on the menu tonight? So there's a lot of opportunities. What sort of advice would you give to transitioners that are wanting to or considering going into financial services, background reading, etc., etc.? What advice would you give them?
I think it's kind of with any transition, the general sort of advice, network, get out there, speak. There's a plethora now of veterans that work within financial services. It is very easy to go on LinkedIn, type in a bank, do past jobs, put all the military branches in, and you will find someone within that organization who is in the military, who is now in that bank or whatever the financial institution is. Connect with them. Just say, I'm a service leaver looking at coming into financial services, would be great to link up for a chat. So have those conversations, because that will not only put yourself out there, but it will start to build your knowledge of the roles and the areas and the different opportunities available. And with that, the more of those chats you have, the more knowledge you'll build and the better understanding you'll have of making that decision if FS is for you. I would say attend events as well. The financial services sector particularly is really good at hosting insight events. And for most, they'll offer both virtual and in person. So if you're based in some weird, wonderful place and you can't get there in person, you can normally dial in via Zoom. And I would say attend as much as you can. Again, that's then putting you face to face, normally with the recruitment team, with the HR teams that run the programs, which is what you want to do. And then, in terms of prep, some roles, if you want to be very specific, front office roles particularly, yes, you probably are going to need to sort of seek some form of qualification to help your application. But I know from my own experience, it's not required. It may be a plus, but don't get caught up on the badge collecting side of, I need to do this qualification, I need to do that qualification. The bank wants you for you and your military qualities. Once you're in, they'll tell you what you need to go and get and what you need to train to do. So again, it's not saying don't do it, but don't get hung up on it. So they'd be kind of my main sort of points to put across. I don't know if Chris has probably got some points to add as well.
I think I would agree. I would echo everything that Rich has said. A couple of my bits of advice would be, first of all, set a process in place. So consider geographically where you want to live, because there is financial services companies the length and breadth of the UK, but it does matter. Well, so choose where you want to work in terms of where you want to be based geographically. Then go on LinkedIn and find as many financial services companies as you can. When you follow one, say JP Morgan, it gives you a list of other ones. Follow every single one of them. You'll find little niche companies that you'll never have heard of as well, but they're actually super well-established financial services companies. They're just not Barclays or Goldman's or JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley or HSBC. They're not what you would call a higher tier bank, but it doesn't mean that they're not absolutely legitimate and awesome financial services companies. And a lot of them offer fully remote and hybrid and bits and pieces. So that's my big one. Then to tie into Richie's part in the process, connect with as many people as you possibly can and have as many conversations as you possibly can. And then the other aspect it would be is what I've always said is there's two things you can take away from a networking chat is ask someone what they do for a day-to-day. Like, what is your BAU? What is your day-to-day? And then can you give me a name of someone else to go and connect with? So never leave a networking call without having got another name. And yeah, as Lester said there's some good consultancy firms out there, Capco and who support financial services and their consultancy roles. If you feel like you want a softer landing, always, as Richie said, go to the insight events, have a look at the big banks who've got military programs.
And Lester's made a good point there. There was that point, the consulting firms, but the other point, if you don't ask, you don't get. Shy bands getting out, as they say, north of the border. So really important point from me is start having those conversations right early on, because you might actually find you may have a bag of LCAS credits that you could start using to get you to a certain point before you've actually leaving. If you have those conversations early on, you can actually tailor the way you use those LCAS credits. I've got a big bee in my bonnet about LCAS credits at the moment because 80% of them go unused. So that's a big one.
And I think to just quickly tack on to that, it depends. Like the more time you have, the more specific you can get. Like if you start networking early out, you start to recognise, okay, I definitely want to work in banking. Okay, actually, I really quite like the sound of financial crime is a big one, to Rich's point. And then it's like, well, actually, okay, I do want to, that is what I really like the look of. Then that's when you start to think, okay, if I'm 100% sure this is where I want to go, then you can start looking at your KYC stuff, AML, any qualifications around financial crime, because obviously that's going to super help.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. neatly have come to the end of our half-hour slot. Before I say cheerio to everybody, is there any last words that you want to give to anyone leaving the armed forces, or anyone, indeed, any veteran that's looking at getting into
one quick one for me, which Rich will echo, guarantee. Financial services is not an officer sport, not just an officer sport.
Yeah, and I back that up. And obviously, you got two former Royal Marine NCOs sat here at two of the biggest investment banks in the world. So, that's definitely true. And what I would say is back yourself. Do not discount yourself from any process. Just go for it. What have you got to lose? Put your application in. Just give it a go. Go for it. Not saying just willy-nilly, just apply. Like, put the work in, go for it, and you'll be surprised how far you get.
Yeah, and you made a point there. If you do your homework, you get genned up, then you've got as good chance as a lot of people. Because if you're putting yourself out there and reading up to a job or learning up to a job, somebody that's at a higher level is probably expecting film star salaries, and you're actually expecting a more realistic one. So there's that to consider as well. Listen, guys, that was absolutely brilliant. A really good insight into the opportunities and how you found the transition. And I'd just like to thank you very much for joining us. And I'd like to thank Lester, Richard, Terry, and don't forget Mark, and who's gone off on a taking his family somewhere, I think. But thank you very much for joining us, everybody, and we will see you next week. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having us.
Cheers. Thank you.